Well, joining us now with more perspective on President Obama's win and a look ahead into his second term is Emira Woods, co-director, Foreign Policy in Focus, Institute for Policy Studies. Ms. Woods, welcome to In Focus.
Pleasure to be with you always. Vincent.
Yes. Now, celebrations going on elsewhere, and of course, disappointments in other places. Tell me, in your personal capacity as an American of African descent, also, what was your immediate reaction to this victory?
Surprise, excitement. Clearly, what we saw throughout the evening yesterday was people, lines and lines of people waiting to make sure they exercised their democratic right to vote. There were people who waited 3-4 hours. We were getting text messages, phone calls from friends saying we're in line and we're not leaving. And that excitement continued through the evening up through the results.
Yes. We know that throughout the 4 years of President Barack Obama's tenure, there have been voices of disappointment even from those who loved him and those who elected him. How do you explain that he still got this love and this enthusiasm from the voters?
Well, you know, with elections, it comes down to money or numbers. And here, what we saw was a president who put forward a populist campaign, reaching out, saying, I understand your pain in the midst of an economy still in crisis. I understand your pain in the midst of a hurricane hitting New York City and elsewhere, right? And we will look out for each other. There is a role for government to play. This populist message brought together a coalition, unprecedented, of young people of color, blacks and browns. The Latinos came out in record numbers in support of the Democrats. African Americans and of course African immigrants as well came out in full force, higher numbers even than in 2008 in support of President Obama. Plus you had added to that unions coming out in high numbers, making sure that workers were there, knocking on doors, making phone calls, getting out the vote. You had also a clear movement of people supporting gay rights, LGBTI issues here in this country. With that issue on a number of ballots from Maryland to Missouri, you had a number of these states where people were able to bring their activism to the polls, and that was reflected well in the results.
Some of his critics, I mean, who really loved him and liked him as president, but still had some issues to pick with him. They said there are things he could not do, he could not achieve in his first term because of certain realities of a first term. What do you think President Barack Obama can achieve in the second term that he could not have achieved in the first term?
Well, I think that's the critical issue here. A second term almost frees up the incumbent to be able to accomplish the goals that you couldn't accomplish in the first term when you're still worried about being reelected down the road. Not having to campaign again for president frees up opportunities for not only the president, but really the movement that helped to put him in office for the second term, to push an agenda that actually puts the needs of people first, an agenda that pays attention to the economy from the bottom up, taking into account the needs of working class communities all across this country, an agenda that pushes issues of climate change that is impacting not only the U.S. but the entire world, understanding that that issue is really going to determine the future of this planet, clearly an agenda on issues of security and peace and to what extent the U.S. can actually end wars internationally and put those dollars to use for more constructive means in the U.S. and around the world.
Now, if we cross the Atlantic and go to Africa, so many Afrocentric residents of this country, and even some people who live in Africa, felt like President Obama did not do so much of the continent. What do you hope for now?
Well, 2008 was a historic election. It was a son of Africa coming to the White House. The expectations were so high. So it may be that those expectations could really never be met. But the reality is that for many, it seemed as if Africa was pushed to the back burner. After all, there was a policy a document put out, a strategy paper for Africa, but it came 3.5 years into the first term of the Obama administration. So some see that as a real red flag as to how Africa was being prioritized by the administration. But I think now, with the opportunity of a second term, there is the possibility to kind of hit the reset button.
So do you think people saw it as being a factor of certain internal issues, or just that was his attitude? Maybe that was his position as regards Africa.
I think there was a sense that there was a lot on the plate, clearly, with everything going on in Syria, with still the war in Afghanistan, with lingering problems still in Iraq. There was a lot on the agenda. And I think what many saw was, a deprioritization of Africa at a time when Africa was actually increasing in its significance, not only to the U.S., but to the entire world. The level to which Africa's resources are driving the global economy. 25% of the oil that comes to the U.S. comes from Africa. Clearly, the centrality of the continent demands greater attention and greater prioritization. But that wasn't really reflected in terms of the foreign policy agenda set in the first term. And I think there are many that are more hopeful that that can be reflected now, beginning maybe even with an Obama second trip to Africa pretty early on in this second term.
Yeah. Like a real trip. Some people feel like the trip was really...
Egypt and Ghana were the start, but many see a broader agenda going forward.
Thanks a lot, Emira. We'll continue with the conversation here. Emira Woods, we're going to have more election insights from Emira Woods shortly.